Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our second Spring 2021 virtual executive speaker event. My name is Dr. Nicole Coppell, and I'm the MBA director. The format of this evening's session will be a presentation by our featured speaker, Ralph Izzo, followed by a fireside chat facilitated by our own executive in residence, Dennis Bone. If time permits, we'll take a few minutes at the end to take questions from the audience. We invite you to enter questions using the Q&A feature found on the bottom of your Zoom session, your Zoom screen. And now I have the honor of introducing Dr. Kimberly Hollister, Dean of the Feliciano School of Business, who will be introducing our featured guest.
Thank you, Nicole. Good evening, everyone, and happy spring. Welcome to tonight's virtual executive speaker series event. We are so pleased to have with us this evening Ralph Izzo, Chairman, President, and Chief Executive Officer of Public Service Enterprise Group Incorporated, most of you know as PSEG. Ralph is a nationally known and admired leader within the utilities industry and in the public policy arena. He is also a scientist and a scholar. He began his career at Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory conducting fusion energy research after receiving his bachelor's and master's degrees in mechanical engineering and a PhD in applied physics from Columbia University. He later added an MBA in finance from Rutgers. In his nearly 3 decades at PSEG, Ralph has held various executive positions within the company, including PSEG Senior Vice President for Utility Operations, Vice President for Appliance Services, Vice President Electric Ventures, and PSEG Vice President for Corporate Planning. As PSEG head and chair of the Nuclear Energy Institute, he's frequently asked to testify before Congress and speak to organizations on matters pertaining to national energy policy. Ralph is a member of the U.S. Department of Energy's Fusion Energy Sciences Advisory Committee, and he sits on a number of corporate and nonprofit directorial and advisory boards. We are honored that Ralph has made the time to speak with us this evening about PSEG and the 117-year-old company's very modern commitment to clean energy generation and continuous infrastructure improvement and investment. Ralph's presentation will be followed by a fireside chat with our good friend and executive in residence, Dennis Bone, who is himself former president of another corporate giant, Verizon New Jersey. We'll leave 10 minutes or so at the end for your questions. So without further delay, and with many thanks to both Ralph and Dennis, please join me in welcoming Ralph Izzo.
Thank you, Dean Hollister. Appreciate those kind words. If we can have the first slide, I think what I'll do tonight is just share with you a little bit of information about PSEG. Presumably, we're somewhat familiar to all of the audience members, but we are one of a handful of companies that have taken on the challenge of climate change with a great deal of interest and enthusiasm. This is the one slide I'll share with you in terms of a little bit of a financial background on the company. The PSEG stands for Public Service Enterprise Group, and we are made up of 2 companies, PSEG, which is probably the entity that's most familiar to you, which is our regulated utility. Think of it as owning the pipes and wires that deliver electricity and natural gas. And then a separate company, both under the parent, which I chair and oversee, called PSEG Power, which is a regional competitive generation business, primarily driven by a nuclear power fleet and increasingly interested in carbon-free sources of electricity. The combined profitability of the 2 companies last year were a little over $1.7 billion, with 3/4 of that coming from the regulated utility and 1/4 of that coming from the merchant generation business. As a company, as I said a moment ago, we are increasingly focused on climate change and what it means for our customers, our investors, and all of our stakeholders. And we've put forth a 5-part thesis on what we ought to do as a society to battle climate change, which we really do believe is an existential threat for society. So next slide, please. I'm not going to give a physics lesson or a science lesson, but I will remind you that a variety of highly reputable organizations, from our own National Academy of Sciences So here I'm quoting the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, have identified what it takes to avoid more than a 1.5 degrees Celsius change in global climate temperatures by the year 2030, which are viewed as sort of a threshold when, in extremely non-technical terms, really bad things start to happen. So now the question is, are we rising to that challenge? And the sad reality is we are not. In fact, even if every country met their commitments in the Paris Climate Accords, we would not realize the atmospheric concentrations of CO2 required to keep the global temperatures below this 1.5 degree change. And in fact, were it not for the pandemic's impacts in the year 2020, global emissions of carbon dioxide in particular and greenhouse gases in general would be increasing. So what should we do about that in the United States at the very least? Next slide, please. I'll discuss 5 things we need to think about to tackle climate change, and it really is an all of the above approach. I'll begin by describing a price on carbon, how we can make sure that people are supplied with the cleanest energy possible, how we can use less of that energy, and then how we can go about electrifying the rest of the economy given this new cleaner supply of electricity. Next slide, please. What I'm showing you here is how power prices were predicted to behave in one of the most actively traded regional hubs where electricity is transacted. The name of it is secondary. It's referred to as the PJM West hub. And what you could see is that the top line showed in September of 2018 what people expected to be paying for wholesale power in the year 2021, 2022, and 2023. And the expectations were that power prices would decline from $30 to $29. By the next year, September of 19, the yellow line was the predicted price for wholesale power into the future. And you could see that it came down basically $1.50 in every year. And then in May of 2020, I see I need to update this slide, power prices were predicted to be even lower. And this is being driven largely by the fact that natural gas, which is the fuel of choice and the #1 source of electricity production, the conversion of natural gas is the #1 source of electricity production in the United States today, has been increasingly available to power plant owners at lower and lower prices due to advances in technology known as horizontal drilling. So these lower and lower prices for electricity have had a profound effect on the willingness of power suppliers to use natural gas as their fuel of choice. So what does that mean for other sources of electricity? If we can have the next slide. A power generator that makes use of natural gas in rough numbers emits about half a ton of carbon dioxide for every megawatt hour of electricity that is produced. And if you believe the National Academy of Sciences, if I may have the next slide, every ton of carbon that we emit costs society about $50. And this is in various forms. It has to do with health impacts. It has to do with the need to adjust and adapt to climate change's impact in terms of more severe storms, sea level rise, and a whole litany of other impacts that society is subject to as the climate changes. So if a natural gas plant can operate without paying this penalty of $50 for every ton of carbon it emits, it looks fairly inexpensive. In fact, if we could take a look at the next slide, you'll see what I mean about putting a price on carbon. Let's just take 2 competing technologies. At today's price of natural gas and the way in which energy markets are designed, an efficient natural gas plant could begin to make money at a power price in excess of $13 a megawatt hour. Now, remember, a moment ago, I showed you that power prices are at about $27, $28 per megawatt hour. So natural gas plants are highly, highly profitable in this market. Now, that $13 simply represents the marginal cost of producing a megawatt hour of electricity. So the difference between the market price of 27 and 13 would be the inframarginal revenue that power plant would enjoy and would go towards recovery of its capital cost to build the plant and a reasonable return expectation on the part of the investor. Now, the cost of operating a nuclear plant, which is carbon free, is about $30 per megawatt hour. And I'm guilty of mixing a little bit of apples and oranges here. The gas plant at $13 a megawatt hour is almost all fuel cost. A typical gas plant employs maybe 15 to 20 people. So its labor component is a very, very small part of that $13 a megawatt hour. And I'm treating it here as if it were a variable cost, which I would argue it is not. In the case of a nuclear plant, its fuel cost is only about $8 to $9 per megawatt hour, but it has a huge labor component that is required to operate the nuclear plant, thus bringing it up to this more $30 per megawatt hour. So the nuclear plant appears to be a competitive loser compared to the gas plant. If, however, you were to charge the gas plant for its carbon emissions, thus the phrase put a price on carbon, and use the National Academy standard of $50 per ton, what you would see is that the cost of operating a gas plant would be an additional $25 on top of the 13, and suddenly the nuclear plant would be the more economic choice. Here I've chosen nuclear and natural gas. The same could be done for coal and wind or any carbon emitter versus a non-carbon emitter. And the current relative non-competitive position of the carbon-free emitter would be reversed. And suddenly that carbon emitter would be the uncompetitive choice for power plants. In the case of natural gas, which emits half a ton of carbon for every megawatt hour, you would be adding $25 in cost. In the case of coal, which emits a full ton of carbon dioxide for every megawatt hour, you would be adding a full $50 per ton. So putting a price on carbon is the number one thing we need to do to be able to then select the tools which are the most economically efficient ones to use to create a carbon-free electric supply. So one of those options would be, next slide, please, renewable energy. In the absence of this price on carbon, many states have developed different mechanisms to subsidize renewable energy to offset this lack of pricing of externalities that's missing from our current wholesale power market, where carbon is essentially does not yield a cost, does not impose a cost on fossil fuel generators. Next slide, please. But what we end up with is this patchwork quilt of states applying different requirements in terms of what they want to see in terms of renewable energy. Some states not imposing any requirements, and other states mandating more than 50% renewable energy. New Jersey has a 100% carbon-free target by the year 2050. I must admit, states are doing a better job nowadays of realizing, well, wait a minute, we shouldn't focus on a renewable portfolio standard because that's not the problem we're trying to solve. The problem isn't an absence of renewables. The problem is the emission of carbon. So we should simply come up with a carbon-free standard and a greenhouse gas reduction goal. And renewables are certainly a critical part of that solution. But if we can do it in other ways, then that would be great too. But this hodgepodge of standard setting results in very different implied prices of carbon depending upon what state you operate in. And that's not a particularly efficient way to operate a market. Next slide, please. Now, the good news is renewable technology, here I'm showing you some data on solar energy, has been coming down in cost. So that technology is racing to be competitive even in the absence of a price on carbon. However, it's very much geographically dependent. It's also dependent upon the scale and nature of the installation. As you can see here, residential solar is still almost 70% more expensive than large non-residential. and also more expensive than anything that would be grid connected, which I'm not showing here, which would be the least cost of all. That would be sort of a major development out in a industrial zone or in a open space installation that might be available. The subsidies are also quite challenging in a state like New Jersey, which is land constrained, where the vast majority of our solar installations are in residential properties. Next slide, please. Here I show you in PSEG territory, the recipients of these subsidies to build solar on rooftop. The magnitude of the subsidies are in excess of $200 per megawatt hour. Remember a moment ago, I mentioned that wholesale power prices are about $25 to $30 per megawatt hour. So on top of that intrinsic value of the electricity coming from the solar, you have this additional subsidy of, in some cases, $230 per megawatt hour, but I'll just use $200 per megawatt hour in round terms. Well, that has to be paid for by someone, and that's paid for by the subsidizer. And that subsidizer, in the case of federal tax credits, is the US average citizen whose income level is about $54,000 a year. And the specific New Jersey subsidy, which is the $200+ one that I mentioned a moment ago, that median income is $73,000. And these two populations are subsidizing rooftop solar that's going on the homes of people, as you can see here, earning quite a bit more than that. And I'm not being critical of the beneficiaries of the subsidies, but I am being critical of the design of the subsidy and its highly regressive nature. Next slide, please. So New Jersey, despite its enthusiasm for solar, unfortunately can't do anything about the amount of sunshine that we receive. So even though New Jersey is among the leaders in installed solar capacity, we are among the laggards in terms of the effectiveness of that solar capacity. We just simply don't have the sunshine of Colorado or Arizona or Nevada or other places. So if you look over the past 5 years, you can see that the amount of subsidy in the form of something called the solar renewable energy credit that we've experienced in New Jersey has been around this $200 level I mentioned a moment ago. That implies a cost of carbon mitigation of about $400 per ton, a factor of 8 higher than what the National Academy says we ought to be spending. Next slide, please. Now, the next wave of renewables will be offshore wind. And here you have states along the East Coast pledging to build about 30 gigawatts of offshore wind. And this is real. We now have projects that are under construction for hundreds of megawatts. And soon we'll have a project under construction that PSEG will be participating in for 1,000 megawatts just off the coast of New Jersey down in the more southerly part of the state. And states from Rhode Island and Massachusetts and Connecticut and New York and New Jersey and Maryland and Virginia are all rather enthusiastic about building the supply chain that will be needed to support this industry. If we can go to the next slide, the good news here is that unlike rooftop solar, which has been the primary method for developing renewables in New Jersey, offshore wind is less expensive. It's more economically efficient. But at the one and only project that's been approved in New Jersey so far, that implied price of carbon will be about $105 per metric ton removed. So once again, higher than what the National Academy says, but this is a price that is coming down. The original projects that were built in this regard in Massachusetts and some of the prices that were originally seen in Maryland, some of the first movers would have seen $200 to $300 per ton of carbon. So it's encouraging to see this kind of reduction in the cost of the technology, but it is still not where it needs to be. And one just has to be careful that the enthusiasm for building out the offshore wind projects are viewed in the context of that price reduction. So a price on carbon would help us make intelligent choices about where to locate renewables, because renewables do have an important role to play, and which renewables to use in which locations. we can go to the next slide. The third aspect of climate change mitigation that we are champions of are preserving the existing nuclear fleet in the nation. I know there's some controversy over the economics of building new nuclear plants, and I won't address that in this discussion, but I will simply point out that in New Jersey, as an example, our nuclear plants represent 40% of the electricity consumed in the state and 90% of the carbon-free energy produced in the state. Nationwide, nuclear is responsible for 20% of the electricity produced and over 50% of the energy produced that is carbon-free. Next slide. Oops, I've already mentioned this, so we can go on to the next slide. But basically, our nuclear plants, if they were not operating in New Jersey, would result in 13 million tons of carbon being emitted to the atmosphere, more than is emitted today. Unfortunately, because of the lack of a price on carbon, nuclear is losing out to natural gas in many places around the country. And it's also under pressure as renewables become subsidized by renewable energy as well, because the renewable energy, because of the subsidy stream coming from outside the energy market, appears inexpensive within the energy market, despite these rather large subsidy streams that are benefiting the construction of the renewable facilities. So you can see here numerous plants that have been retired and many more plants whose retirement is threatened, and other plants who have had to be saved by state actions, including our very own plants here in New Jersey. Next slide, please. If you look at the size of the subsidy that our nuclear plants receive in New Jersey, which is capped currently at $10 per megawatt hour, that translates into a implied cost of CO2 avoided of $18 per ton. So very much below the National Academy of Sciences social cost of carbon, and at the risk of sounding critical of renewable, quite a bit below what it costs to subsidize renewable energy in New Jersey today. So next slide is the fourth endeavor that we should embrace in pursuit of climate change mitigation. And it's my favorite tool in the toolkit, and that is energy efficiency. Next slide, please. The amount of energy efficiency that's been taking place in the country has been pretty significant. Between 1990 and today, we've saved enough energy to have avoided the construction of 313 large power plants. And if we built those power plants during that time frame, it's pretty obvious that they would have been fossil fuel power plants. So energy efficiency is a critical part of battling climate change. And if we go to the next slide, we see that despite how much we've done, there is still so much more we can do. Here I'm showing you the results of a somewhat dated study done by the Electric Power Research Institute. And it shows that we could realize 10 to 30% lower energy demand if we were to more ambitiously pursue energy efficiency than what is a business as usual case. Time doesn't allow me to go into all the details and the assumptions behind these. But if you have an interest, just take a look at the United States in terms of its energy efficiency. Put energy consumption in the numerator and put whatever parameter you want in the denominator, dollar of GDP per capita, per square foot of livable residential space. And you will see that by just about any measure, as a matter of fact, I'm not aware of any, where what I'm about to say isn't true. The US is an energy hog, and we could just do a lot better when it comes to energy efficiency. In fact, the EPRI study, next slide, please, says that if we just wanted to make rational economic decisions, we could save up to 17.5% of the electric demand that we realize now in the US. And it varies by state, but not surprisingly, the air conditioning intense southern states would be the places where most of that energy could be saved, although no state is without its opportunity. Next slide, please. And if you compare energy efficiency against conventional technologies, I'm not even talking about the more expensive renewables, you see that from a lifetime cost, the cost of the technology over its full life, energy efficiency is by far the most logical thing for folks to be investing in. In fact, here we're being a bit punitive to energy efficiency because many times energy efficiency can result in cost savings to the consumer and actually reducing their bill, having a sort of a negative cost per megawatt hour. On the pie chart on the right, I'm just trying to represent here how much can be done in the home, in appliances, in smart buildings. Basically, large energy consuming heavy industry has already sought to optimize their energy consumption patterns. So it really is the smaller user. Forgive me for if the following term sounds more pejorative, but the less sophisticated energy user who could be doing a much better job. I'm delighted to say, next slide, that we've been granted approval by the Board of Public Utilities in New Jersey to invest $1 billion in energy efficiency over the next 3 years. Unfortunately, while New Jersey ranks very high in terms of our solar installations, we rank 34th in the nation for electric energy efficiency and 24th for gas efficiency. And we've just been given approval of a program that will result in a net savings to New Jersey of $1 billion and an overall reduction in carbon emissions of 8 million tons. So that literally is an implied price of carbon of negative $125 per ton of carbon removed. Here we use zero just because we want to point out that hopefully in the future we'll be able to expand that program, and we might not have the advantage of being able to pick off the low-hanging fruit that this program takes advantage of. But suffice to say, we will be removing carbon for a lot less expensive than any other technology. The fifth and final element, next slide, please. After we've set a price on carbon, after we've used that price on carbon to clean up our supply, to accelerate our energy efficiency and use less electricity than we do today, then we should turn our attention to what is the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions, both in New Jersey and in the nation as a whole, which is transportation. Next slide, please. Electric vehicle sales are projected to increase throughout the nation, but there's tremendous amount of uncertainty as to how quickly that will happen. And there's also a tremendous amount of uncertainty as to what it will cost to realize this. Sadly, New Jersey is lagging in some other states' adoption of electric vehicles. Leading states would be states like California, Massachusetts, and even Georgia. Next slide, please. I'm pleased to announce that the BPU has granted us the right to invest $166 million over the next 6 years to facilitate the construction of charging stations so that consumers can overcome their range phobia, which we think is a tremendous impediment to the purchase of electric vehicles in the state. Next slide, please. So setting a price on carbon will then be the critical method, the critical tool that we'll use to decide how much and which and where of the subsequent 4 tools we would apply to achieve a carbon-free economy. How much energy efficiency makes sense? Where do renewables make sense, be that wind or solar? Whether or not we should retain the existing nuclear fleet? How quickly should we convert from gasoline to electrify transportation? And then, not on the slide, but how much beyond transportation should we electrify the economy? The absence of a price on carbon results in the next slide, and it will be my final slide that I will speak to. Here you see the implied cost of carbon abatement in New Jersey today in the absence of a price on carbon. In the case of energy efficiency, as I said, we'll call it zero, but it's in fact in our programs, negative $125. New Jersey is part of something called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, where carbon prices in the not too distant past were about $6. I think they've gone up more to about $8 or $9 per ton of carbon removed. A Class 1 renewable energy certificate, which largely goes to fund out-of-state wind, is about $14. Our nuclear subsidy is about $18. The National Academy suggests a social cost of carbon of 50. And then you can see what offshore wind and a solar renewable energy credit result in terms of cost of carbon removal. Whatever the right number is, I would not be so immodest to suggest I can tell you what it is. Again, I tend to hang my hat on the National Academy, but I can tell you this, there shouldn't be 8 different prices associated with carbon mitigation. There should be an agreed upon, a visible price, and then the efficient resources of the market can decide what are the tools that we use to mitigate for that. And with that, Dennis, I'll stop. I have other slides that I could have shown, but I want to be respectful of the time that we allotted and the desire to engage in more of a conversation.
So Ralph, it is really good that you're joining us this evening. And I know that was, I learned a lot just from your presentation that you just went through. But just one more question there. Of the 5 things to tackle climate change, which one do you think should come first? Does it have to do with whether it's the most urgent or the most achievable?
Oh, yeah, I was with you until you threw that last change in it. So I'm not a fan of perfection becoming the enemy of the good. So the most important is a price on carbon, but it is not the most achievable. So I applaud the efforts of Governor Murphy and other states who are setting renewable portfolio standards and carbon mitigation reductions. Candidly, it's not the optimal use of our environmental dollars. You end up getting these these very questionable, maybe quasi-irrational decisions about how a dollar is spent, but we have to act. And in the absence of the price on carbon, I think the states are justified in doing what they're doing.
Right. So, well, first of all, thank you for all that information. And I know our audience, our MBA students, all who, or most who, want to become successful business leaders. Can you share some thoughts, Ralph, on how you came to the energy sector and to PSEG? Because you had a very distinguished career going on as a PhD physicist.
Well, it's kind of you, Dennis. Yeah, at the risk of dating myself, my driver's license, which I counted the hours and minutes and nanoseconds before I would receive it, was given to me right during something called the Arab oil embargo. And I think that today's graduate student probably will have to Google what that was and when that was, but it was in the 70s. Similarly, there was tremendous tension over socio-political, the Cold War, basically, concerns that we had over creeping communism and how that could move from Asia to the Near East and then to the Middle East. And candidly, as an idealistic youth, I thought it was insane that we would fight wars over oil. So I decided fairly early on in life that I would pursue an education in energy sciences and thus a mechanical engineering degree. And when I learned about fusion energy research, I thought, wow, seawater could power the planet. And it's basically solar energy. I mean, that's how the sun generates its energy. It undergoes fusion reactions. So I thought that's how I should dedicate my life. And then I just sort of became interested in public policy because I noticed that the Fusion Energy Lab support was not purely a function of the good work that the scientists were doing there, but also in competition with things like then President Reagan's Star Wars initiative and various other competition for federal dollars. So I got bitten a bit by the public policy bug and went to Washington and then worked for a governor in New Jersey and then went to work at PSEG just to round out my background so that I can go back and be a really good public servant and go back to public policy. And maybe I'll do that someday, but it's been 28 years since I made that move. So probably far more detailed than anybody was interested in. But it started with what I viewed as absolute insanity that countries would go to war over energy and the fact that we needed clean and plentiful supply of energy.
Great. So now you're in the business world. You're at PSEG, and then you've been incredibly successful there. And I'm sure our MBA students, again, many of them, would want to hear, what was your secret? How how did you get from where you were to being the chairman and president and CEO?
So I get that question whenever I speak to college audiences or graduate student audiences and that. And I have to be brutally honest and beg the audience to never underestimate the important role of hard work, enjoying what you're doing, and luck. Because when I walked into my interview in 1992 at PSEG, it never dawned upon me to research a critically important question that would determine whether or not I had a chance to become CEO. And that critically important question was, how old was the incumbent? And what was our age differential? And as luck would have it, our age differential was 15 years. So when he was ready to retire, I was 50 years old and had 15 years of experience under my belt. If I had been 35 years old with 5 years of experience under my belt, I might have been the next generation's candidate, but not the current candidate. If I had been 58 or 59 years old with 30 years under my belt, I would have been viewed as having too short a runway. But candidly, when I stepped in the building, that was never on my agenda. I was trying to save the world from making bad energy decisions. And I thought this would be a great company to do it. It had a progressive reputation. People worked hard. It was a great corporate citizen. I thought I could hold my head up high and tell people I worked here. And I had great assignments every step of the way. I'm sorry, but if you're looking for somebody who can tell you how to plan to be CEO, you're not asking the right guy, because I didn't have it as a plan.
Oh, that's good. So a little bit to the here and now, because the last year we've been all, challenged by this pandemic that we're all trying to deal with. And I know the business community is, has had to adjust and make all sorts of different decisions, about your employees. And in your case, you have, employees who work outside, building lines and fixing, things and stuff like that. So they got to be there every day. But how would you describe the stress of the past year and anything that you took away from that was of significant value to you and your company?
Yeah, this has been by far the toughest year in my 14 years as CEO. We have about half of our employees working remotely and half who are reporting to the job site. We've had 1,300 cases of COVID-19. I'm told most of those, based on the analysis we've done, the vast majority were contracted, not on the job. We've had 4 fatalities from COVID-19, from people ranging in age from 28 years old to 60 years old. So no matter what the statistics tell you about the most likely fatalities to result from this, please don't tell that to the young children who lost their 28-year-old dad at PSEG. The stress on the employees to continue to deliver and yet respect the boundaries of physical distancing, changes in our procedures is enormous. But the stress on the remote employee is enormous as well. I worry about all of our employees. I'll give you one example of a type of employee that I worry a lot about. It's the parent of the young family who's now sitting at the kitchen table or the dining room table and is in a meeting with me, and their 3-year-old doesn't understand why mommy won't or daddy won't play with them. And the spouse doesn't understand why they won't engage in some hot topic. So how does that individual behave in a way that is perceived to be the perfect parent, the perfect partner, the perfect employee? That's just not humanly possible. I'm fortunate. I have 2 20-something-year-old kids that I want to talk to them a lot more than they want to talk to me. We think we're in heaven, right? We're having dinner every night because they're both in pursuing academic careers and chose to save some rent and come home. I'm in heaven. I get to have dinner with them every night. They're probably not in heaven. The last thing they want to be doing is having dinner with me every night. So it affects everyone differently. At the risk of offering a personal challenge that I've experienced, is that while, as you know, Dennis, when you were in charge of Verizon, we have 24/7 jobs, and that's not seeking pity, but that's the kind of jobs we have. But the physical separation associated with leaving the office or leaving wherever I was and coming home, I never fully appreciated how valuable that is. And that physical separation is gone now. And that is something that I caution my employees about, because I know I'm feeling that. And I'm not someone who was able to shut off when I got home before, but now there are no boundaries and everything is melded into one. So I worry about not only the physical impact of coronavirus, but the impact it's having on relationships for our employees, as parents, as spouses, as employees, and the mental impact it's having as well.
Yeah, that's a really good comprehensive example coming through your eyes with what you've experienced with your employees. And we chatted about this a little bit before this program began. I reviewed your ESG performance report that just came out. And by the way, it is a really, really well done and just populated with all sorts of examples. And so the question is, with everything in the ESG world, environmental, social, governance, and we think of PSEG, or I think PSEG is pretty much all about environmental, or the lion's share of what you focus on is. But when I went through that report, and for example, on the social side, there's probably more examples of how PSEG was trying to make a difference, in the communities and the lives around. So how important is ESG to PSEG as well as all corporate entities in today's age? It certainly was not it certainly wasn't like 10 years ago. It was probably not on many people's radar, and now it seems to be very prominent. So what's your thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And it's critically important to us. So to support what you said, Dennis, on the environmental score, we were one of the first people to sign on to the climate change initiative of President Bill Clinton. So our efforts in the environment they're longstanding. When Lisa Jackson left DEP and went to head EPA, I don't think I'm incorrect. She told me that was one of the first phone calls she made to get help with my industry on mercury reductions, right? So from an environmental point of view, I think our credentials have long been established. Candidly, on the other dimensions, the S and the G, we saw that first and foremost among our European investors gaining in prominence. And it's really been slow in gaining prominence in the US, but now it's catching on with a vengeance. We have turned a corner where our attitude used to be, unless it directly affects us as a company, we don't really have a role to play. We've said, no, that's not right anymore. Silence on certain matters is now complicity, is being complicit with some of the problems that need to be resolved. So we've been active in battling systemic racism. We've been active in battling gender inequities. We've been active in contribution disclosure, saying, Citizens United shouldn't be an excuse to hide money. And it's starting to really actually show up in so many ways in a very positive outcome. Our employees are proud of us. They're eager to work for us. We are being rated by independent entities like Sustainalytics and MSCI and ISS, people who rank you for your ESG scores well above our peers. As a matter of fact, MSCI gave us a AA rating. The highest you can get is AAA. So I think that while it feels good and it's the right thing to do, it's also got a tremendous shareholder benefit associated with it.
Right, right. Well, again, especially for our MBA students, take a look and see how just the overview up front, maybe 3 or 4 pages, but that's chock full of really, really good information. I have other questions, but to Betsy or Kimberly, or do we have questions from our MBA students?
We do, Dennis. We have a few more minutes if you've got maybe one more question for Ralph, and then we can move to the audience question.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Betsy.
You're welcome.
So the last question I have has to do with how business models in companies are changing over time. And I know I lived through this at Verizon when, cell phones and when other technologies just were completely changing the business model of, how this company was going to operate and create value for our employees. But when you look ahead, how do you see the business model of PSEG? Is it changing? What's impacting it? When you have a vision out, 3, 4, 5 years from now, how do you think the business model at PSEG is going to be the same, or is it going to be different, or what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I see us as a technology agnostic energy infrastructure company to achieve 3 things. Number 1, getting our customers to use as little energy as possible. And I didn't misspeak. If we were to poll everyone on this call and ask them how many folks woke up this morning and said, I can't wait to use a kilowatt hour, I don't think one hand would go up. I check the share price of PSEG every nanosecond. And I didn't wake up this morning saying, I can't wait to use a kilowatt hour. Yesterday, I woke up saying, I can't wait to see the TV program, The Good Doctor. Today, I might be interested in watching March Madness. I don't know if it's on TV or not, but actually I'm eager to get back to a book I've started reading, and it's getting dark out, so I'll need light to do that. So getting our customers to use as little energy as they need to, and yet still live the life that they want to. I'm not talking about going back into caves. I'm talking about having air conditioning systems that are comfortable but aren't energy hogs, lighting systems that don't strain the eyes but are not energy hogs. The second step then is, even though we will reduce the amount of energy customers need to use, let's make sure that what we supply them with is as clean as possible. And that's our nuclear and renewable strategy. In our case, renewables is solar and offshore wind. And we are investing in both. Then after we've supplied them with as little energy as they need and made it as clean as possible, let's make sure that they have unsurpassed reliability in terms of its delivery. And that's going to become increasingly important in the home, Dennis. Post-pandemic, I do think we'll see a lot more people working from home. I don't know what that number will be. But in the past, if you had an outage at your home, it was an inconvenience. You might have to reset some clocks. It might interrupt the television program you were watching. But in the future, it'll interfere with your workday. You might not be able to get in your car and drive to work because your electric vehicle won't be chargeable. You won't be able to call anyone because the battery on your phone will die and you won't be able to recharge it. And you won't be able to communicate by laptop because your battery on your computer will die. So that goes from a minor inconvenience to ruining people's lives. So the reliability that people will experience, not just on sunny days, but the day after a tropical storm hits, will be an entirely different level of adaptation that we'll need to deliver on. And I think that our shareholders can benefit with the right regulatory system when we do all 3 of those. When we help use less, when a light bulb is no different than a transformer, when a solar farm is no different than a coal plant, and when the reliability of the system fits with the value that customers put on it. And that's what we're working on with Governor Murphy and with the BPU, and we're making great progress in bringing about that future.
Awesome. Okay, Betsy.
Okay, we have several questions from the from the audience. And thank you both so much. That was really inspiring and, dare I say, energizing. So the first question we have is about Texas, the recent situation in Texas. And the question is, were lax mandates the issue in Texas?
Well, I'm sorry, the last phrase, Betsy?
Were lax mandates the issue in Texas?
No. So the issue in Texas is that there's a flawed market structure. Customers use electricity at different intensity at different times of year and different times of day. So in New Jersey and in Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic, we have two ways that electricity is compensated. Electric generators are compensated when they actually produce electricity. And many of us are compensated to be available to produce electricity when needed, even though we may not be producing it at the moment. That's a smaller payment, but it's an insurance payment. Texas doesn't have that insurance payment. The theory was, if we ever need somebody to run that doesn't run very often, at those times prices will go through the roof and people will be willing to make outrageous profits for that short period of time and keep their plants around for that 1 in a million opportunity. But what that means is you better be willing to pass on to consumers outrageous prices for brief periods of time. And that's what Texas experienced. And that's how their market's designed. And now Texas is saying, we don't like that. Well, you should have thought that when you designed the market that way. If you wanted to have the reserve capability around, then you should have designed the market differently. Then, of course, they obviously had very extreme weather conditions and different technologies perform differently. I will point out that in terms of what was expected from the different technologies, nuclear produced 73% of what was expected. Natural gas produced about 50% of what was expected, and wind farms produced about 17% of what was expected. So the base load nuclear plants really did perform the best there. So one has to be just careful about new technologies and the resiliency in extreme circumstances. But the fundamental problem in Texas was the design of the market coupled with these extreme weather conditions.
Thank you. A question about nuclear. The idea of increased use of nuclear energy inspires fear in a lot of people. What advances have been made to avoid disasters such as Fukushima, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island? And how can utilities convince their stakeholders that the risk is well managed or can be well managed?
Yeah, so the next generation of nuclear plants will all have what's called passive safety systems, which is to say they won't rely on what we currently call defense in depth, the fact that we have multiple systems that are powered by auxiliary power to correct for any operational mishap that we might experience. And that defense in depth has made the nuclear industry the safest of the domestic electric supply, right? Every one of those examples you mentioned, which resulted in release of radiation offsite, were outside the US. Even 3 Mile Island had no nuclear related safety or health consequences, and that being our worst accident ever. So these passive systems will rely on basically gravity feed and convection to safely shut the plant down. Having said that, there's only one such plant being built right now, and that's in Georgia. And it's budget and it's behind schedule. And it's because of the discomfort, the strong discomfort that the public has that then gets reflected in the regulatory system and some of the challenges it imposes on construction. So I'm not optimistic that we will be building new nuclear in the near future. I'm more optimistic about preserving existing nuclear and investing in renewables.
Interesting. And here's another question about nuclear. What do you attribute US nuclear energy only, to what do you attribute US nuclear energy only making up 20%?
There's no doubt that 3 Mile Island back in the 70s put an end to nuclear construction, just given the regulatory requirements that understandably were imposed and the changing nature of those on highly capital intensive projects. To build a nuclear plant at $5,000 and $6,000 a kilowatt, as opposed to building a natural gas plant at $1,000 a kilowatt. And now with the abundant availability of natural gas, it's just economically not wise to build additional nuclear plants. By the way, that's not the case in China, Korea, and in the Middle East. Their nuclear construction is rather robust and being done for a lot less money with world-class passive technologies.
Wow.
Here's the next question. Does the structure of the energy sector hinder our ability to move forward towards affecting climate change? Follow-up question, do First Energy, PSEG, NGG, et cetera, work together, or is there room for improvement there?
So yeah, the structure of our energy sector does not do a good job of solving the climate change challenge we have. And I know time is short, but there are so many examples of public policy decisions that are actually counterproductive. I'll give you just one simple example, a production tax credit. A wind farm owner gets paid a certain amount of money when they generate wind. And if they don't get that tax, if they're not called upon to run, they don't get this tax benefit. So oftentimes when demand is low and the wind resource is high, the wind owner will actually pay people to use their electricity. Now, if you're an economist, you should be right now falling out of your chair, right? So the negative marginal costs. The wind farm will say that if you let me run, I will bid half of my production tax credit because getting half of it is better than getting none of it. Now, other power plants, for example, a nuclear plant, sees a negative price and they can't make money by paying others to use their electricity. So a nuclear plant has two options. Either they shut down or they stay in and lose money. Because shutting a nuclear plant down then results in a long time to ramp it back up, the nuclear plant operates at the loss. If it happens often enough, the nuclear plant goes away. And that's happened in parts of the Midwest. When that nuclear plant goes away, the wind farm does not replace the nuclear plant because the wind blows when the wind wants to blow. It doesn't blow when customers demand electricity. So what does the regional grid operator have to do? They have to encourage the development of controllable power plants that they can call upon when needed. That is a gas plant. So the gas plant replaces the nuclear plant. So the production tax credit aimed at incentivizing renewable energy so as to produce carbon-free energy ends up resulting in the premature retirement of the carbon-free nuclear plant and the unnecessary development of the new gas plant. That's one of many examples I can give you of the absurdity of when you pick a specific regulatory mechanism or legislative mechanism to encourage a technology as opposed to picking a financial mechanism to encourage an outcome, like the reduced use of carbon through a carbon tax. And no, we are not allowed to cooperate with First Energy or Exxon or other companies, right? We would be subject to the same antitrust limitations in any actions we might take. We cooperate with each other in storm restoration because that's a regulated service.
Interesting. Here's the next question and addressed to you directly. Ralph, what's one lesson you wished you learned earlier in your career?
What's one
Lesson.
Oh, I learned that leading employees and people, really the best way to do that is not just telling people or explaining to people what needs to be done, but helping them to understand why it's important. And I tell you, when once upon a time we tried to change the name of PSEG, we thought that public service made us sound too governmental. And I feared for my life. The employee derives tremendous inspiration from being a public servant, from being able to hold their head up high and rallying after storms to get your power back, being out there in the snow to make sure your heat is working, and explaining to employees why we do certain things is so essential to them maintaining that sense of pride and that sense of service. And you know, we all want a roof over our head. We all want to make sure that our families are healthy. We like to have an occasional vacation, but being proud of our work is so much more important than any of the material benefits that we can supply employees. And I learned that very early on in my career, and hopefully I continue to deliver that message to our employees.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and we could clearly go on for an hour here, but then the last question is, I'm very intrigued by your statement of residential solar panels as opposed to the non-residential solar panels in terms of cost efficiency. Do you think it's even worthwhile to invest in residential solar panels since they are not in the grid connection layout you disseminated?
Yeah. So the short answer in New Jersey is absolutely yes. It is sensible to invest in residential solar panel. So the subsidy structure in New Jersey makes it quite logical for an individual to put solar panels on their roof. I'm critical of that from a societal point of view. Because it's regressive, the chart I showed earlier about how lower income levels are subsidizing higher income levels, and B, because it doesn't maximize society's investment in solar energy. It is cheaper just because of economies of scale to build a 5 megawatt solar farm than it is to build a series of 2 kilowatt rooftop systems. You're just more efficient in your installation. The number of inverters you have to apply, the balance of plant, as we call it, what goes into taking the solar panel energy and delivering it to the grid is more economic when you do a big farm as opposed to a rooftop system. So from a societal point of view, I would be adamant that grid-connected large solar is more economically efficient. But in New Jersey, the subsidies are such that putting solar panels on your roof is a wise decision.
Thank you.
Individual. Yeah.
That good advice. We'll conclude the question and answer portion, and I'll turn this back to Nicole Coppell.
Thanks, Ralph.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Betsy.
Thank you. I can't say enough. What a great education we all got this evening. That was quite impressive, learning just about our ways that we need to be tackling climate change, way New Jersey is working towards energy efficiency, hearing your career path, and of course, the plethora of advice you have for all of our MBA students and undergraduate students that are here this evening. This is quite exciting for us to hear about it, and really we do appreciate your time, and thank everyone for coming this evening. If it's okay, I'm going to give a quick commercial for some of our upcoming events. Roger, do we have that slide? Because we have on Tuesday, April 20th, we have Jack Pedersen, who's going to be our co-founder, who's the co-founder and managing partner at Summit Trails Advisors. And that again is on Tuesday, April 20th. He will talk about his financial firm and how he transitioned as an entrepreneur from being a Wall Street guy and working in large and medium-sized companies to really going on his own, working with a small startup and really growing that program. So this will be an exciting event. And then on June 3rd, on Thursday, June 3rd, we have Rory Cassareer, who will be is a partner at Trouthman and Pepper, who is a real expert in the area of ethics and AI using ethics. So we are looking forward to both of those events as well. So we hope you will join us. And at this point, I'd like to again thank everyone for coming, and most of all, Ralph, for your amazing presentation. And again, a thank you and shout out to Dennis Bone for facilitating a great fireside chat. And thank you again for everyone for coming this evening. And we wish everybody a good and safe next few months, getting through this pandemic and getting your vaccines. And we're looking forward to coming out on the other side of this. So be well, everybody. Have a good night. Thank you.